Most of what middle and high school history lessons taught about Native Americans comes from European accounts of teepees and arrowheads and Thanksgiving dinners. It's an entirely oversimplified history, one that ignores the nuances and diversity of the cultures that lived on North American soil for thousands of years before Columbus accidentally bumped into some Caribbean islands and consisted of a population of more than 20 million people. Life for the people who lived in North America before the Europeans arrived was anything but easy. There was conflict, disease, and natural disaster. However, the years after Columbus first sailed the ocean blue saw a mass increase of violence and hardships that's only now starting to be confronted and dealt with. Welcome back to Nutty History. Today, we're exploring the dangerous lives of Native Americans, pre- and post-European settlement. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of this video may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. Ah yes, the story of Thanksgiving. That symbolic gesture of solidarity between two cultures that sat down to have a peaceful meal together. It's true, the Native Americans did help the Pilgrims out in the first years of their settlement in Plymouth Colony. Pilgrims who had just about starved to death in the harsh winters and were unable to farm much in the rocky soil. By early 1610, 80 to 90% of the settlers had passed, leaving around 1,300 between 1607 and 1624, when thousands had originally made the voyages for new opportunities. The Wampanoag tribe taught the settlers how to use shells to fertilize the soil, to grow corn, and to hunt. They were a huge reason any of the colonists lived long enough to celebrate that first Thanksgiving. However, it wasn't all peace and love. There was also terrible fighting between the settlers of New England and their indigenous neighbors. One of the earliest and most violent was the Pequot conflict. It pitted an alliance between the Massachusetts Bay, Saybrook, Connecticut, and Plymouth colonies against the Pequot and Niantic tribes. But it wasn't just colonists versus natives. Many of these Native American tribes didn't get along, and there were rivalries and conflicts between them over territory and things like the fur trade. The Native Americans were shrewd and discerning. They saw the potential of resources and trade with these pale-skinned, buckle-shoe-wearing foreigners and wanted to take advantage of it. As a result, the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes teamed up with the colonists in the conflict. However, these Native American warriors were soon appalled with the brutal nature of the colonists. The Pequot conflict, which began as both a land grab by the colonists to control the fur trade and as retaliation for the increasingly frequent raids by the Pequots on colonial forts, ended with many casualties. In 1637, colonial forces burned a prominent Pequot fort to the ground in what is today Mystic, Connecticut. Of the estimated 500 or so Pequots inside, only 14 survived. Pequots in surrounding villages then fled, but were quickly caught. In the aftermath, the Pequots were effectively wiped off the face of the earth. Some managed to flee west and integrate with the Mohawk tribe, but the rest were sold into the labor trade and forced to harvest sugarcane in the Caribbean. And while the causes of the conflict may have seemed territorial on the surface, there was a deeper, darker side to it, at least from the standpoint of the Pilgrims. The historian Bernard Bailyn, a leading voice on the early conflicts between colonists and Native Americans, attributes a lot of the fighting to many of the pious Pilgrims' belief that their indigenous neighbors represented the Antichrist and needed to be, well, eliminated. We know most Native American tribes were deeply spiritual. They believed in animism, the idea that nature was imbued with a spirit or a soul. These beliefs allowed them to live more harmoniously with nature. However, Native American tribes didn't always coexist harmoniously. One law practiced widely by many tribes, the law of blood revenge, was particularly gray. The law of blood revenge isn't particularly unique to Native Americans. It's one that has taken many forms for many millennia in many parts of the world. It's a lot like the biblical eye for an eye. Basically, if one Native American ends the life of another, the deceased families had the legal right and social obligation to do the same to someone in the assaulter's family. This often happened between clans and between tribes, and the whole social structure revolved around the respect for retaliation. If the blood revenge was completed, the issue was accepted and resolved, and life went on, though not for the two people whose lives were ended. Despite its very inherent savage nature, The law of blood revenge was deeply spiritual. It was believed that the soul of the victim couldn't enter the spirit world until his death was avenged. This belief even carried into how Native Americans treated animals. The Cherokee, for example, believed that the ghost of a deer killed during the hunt would follow the hunters back to their village in an attempt to exact blood revenge. So, to avoid this, Cherokee hunters would perform special rituals after their successful hunt over the deer. Sometimes the law of blood revenge could get out of hand and lead to something called a mourning war. These were protracted conflicts between clans and tribes due to endless cycles of revenge. Some think that a series of conflicts among the Iroquois during the 15th century actually led them to learn from their mistakes in the practice of blood revenge and organize into a peaceful confederation of clans. There are conflicting accounts of just how peaceful or warlike Native Americans were before Europeans set foot on the continent. On one side, many argue the so-called noble savage story, the idea that Native Americans lived a peaceful, harmonious life before the Europeans messed it all up. On the other side, there are many experts that argue that Native Americans were aggressive before the Europeans ever set foot on the continent. In reality, both sides are probably kind of right. It wasn't utopia before colonization, but it wasn't the belligerent savagery that's bled through the historical records either. The noble savage argument assumes that before civilization, before agriculture and the birth of cities and bureaucracies and hierarchies, people lived in relative peace. They lived healthier lives, more active lives, ate healthier foods, were more egalitarian and concerned about the social welfare of the people around them. In a lot of ways, this is definitely true. Archaeological evidence has shown that tribes all over the world had better teeth, a result of a diverse diet of fruits and nuts and meat, rather than the beer and grain and sugars that marked the beginnings of agricultural civilizations. In North America, some research has shown that evidence of more devastating injuries in Native Americans remains increased by 50% after European contact. This seems to suggest that the indigenous population was significantly more peaceful in pre-Columbian times. It makes sense. The introduction of gunpowder, the chaos and tribal rivalries exploited by Europeans as they marched across the continent, disease and overall increase in hostilities as these foreign people sought to take land for themselves. Yet there has been evidence of widespread conflict among Native Americans in pre-colonial times. One of the most vicious and maybe the most savage times per capita in the history of the world was during the beginning to middle of the 13th century, in and around Mesa Verde in southwest Colorado. Archaeologists there discovered that almost 90% of the skeletal remains in the region from that period showed signs of grave injuries to the brain and extremities, meaning they were either injured or perished in ways that were not natural. Sure, you could maybe chalk these findings up to buffalo stampedes, but the most likely cause is conflict. The apparent savagery that occurred in and around Mesa Verde in the second half of the 13th century led to the near extinction of the Pueblo and Anasazi populations. Some archaeologists estimate that in the middle of the 1200s, there were some 40,000 people living in the northern southwest region of what's now Colorado and Arizona. But by the beginning of the 1300s, that number had been reduced to a grand total of 0. A huge factor for this massive decline was something called the Great Drought. It began around 1276 and lasted until 1300, and most likely led to massive crop failures, a decline in variable animals to hunt, and an overall bad time for the people living in the American Southwest during this period. It's a well-documented fact that resource depletion leads to increased conflict amongst people as they fight to control the few resources after a catastrophe like a flood, drought, volcanic eruption, or whatever else nature has and will throw at us. Evidence of the Great Drought has been confirmed by archaeologists studying tree rings and soil samples around the area. There's still a lot of controversy swarming around why exactly the Anasazi and Pueblo and pretty much everyone else in the region around the 1200s basically disappeared. But there's a good amount of evidence based on archaeological finds that show bone damage and skeletal remains that point to a connection between natural disaster and increased violence. Whatever we may or may not know about the violence or peacefulness of Native American societies before or after Europeans touched down on the continent, there is one certainty. The advent of greedy foreigners in the Americas led to the wiping out of nearly an entire group of people. The indigenous people estimated by some to have made up a population as large as 20 million people across South and North America, were pretty much wiped out. They were forced onto reservations. They were considered aliens in their own land, second-class citizens in the face of a civilizing force of an invading people who thought they themselves represented the pinnacle of humankind and saw these natives as an obstruction, as the Antichrist in some circles. Andrew Jackson, that guy whose face strikes a pose on the $20 bills, said the following after signing the Indian Removal Act, the ink on paper that led to the infamous Trail of Tears. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion? 40 years later, all treaties made with Native Americans were terminated, and were essentially told that they could have some of the worst land the United States has to offer, some of the most barren, unwanted land, and then anyone involved in this process turned a blind eye to anything that might remind them of a past that they stole from the people whose place it was long before any of their ancestors arrived on the shores of the place they now called home. The lives of Native Americans were dangerous in so many ways. Dangerous in a way that the life of any human living hundreds or thousands of years ago would be dangerous. Dangerous in how they were stripped of so much by foreigners who knew so little about the soil their boots were leaving imprints on. What else would you like to know about the lives of Native Americans in a history that has rarely been told in middle school and high school classes? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more Nutty History content.